Okay, the second issue in Chapter 4 that is so incredibly important regarding Pavlovian conditioning is compensatory responses in drug abuse. Drug tolerance and drug addiction have been informed amazingly by research in Pavlovian conditioning, believe it or not. In fact, it was reading about compensatory responses that really hooked me in experimental psychology. The elegance with which Shepard Siegel did experiments on opiate conditioning was just amazing. I thought it was so cool, and the applications were so profound that I was I was hooked. I was hooked. I was hooked, you could say. I was addicted to experimental psychology. Um, the great thing about Pavlovian conditioning research on compensatory responses in drug abuse is that what it shows us is that drug addiction and abuse is a biological problem. It's not. It's a problem that involves processes that are real, that are physical, that are material. All those premises that I gave you, all those assumptions in the first part of the class, um, apply here. Is that it's not something like a personality disorder. It's not something like a weakness. Addiction can be understood in biologically relevant and biological terms, in terms that involve the brain and real physical and material processes. It's not just poor willpower. That was the revolutionary thing about this research. Is what we found was in the early days of psychiatry and psychology, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, the DSM, used to consider drug abuse a problem of willpower or something like that, or lack of self-control and those sorts of things. It turns out that Pavlovian conditioning is heavily involved in drug abuse and conditioning, and it informs not only our treatment but our understanding of it. So it was Wickler that first noted the months after not using in jail, a heroin addict experienced intense withdrawal upon returning to the old neighborhood. Okay, withdrawal symptoms for opiate abuse or heroin abuse include nausea and cold sweats and dry mouth and clammy swim, vomiting, all sorts of fidgetiness, all sorts of things. And it was Wickler that first studied these guys that were in jail. They were in jail for months, and didn't use at all. Went cold turkey and were drug free for months and even years. But the minute they got out of jail and then went back to the old neighborhood, they experienced withdrawal. So it was something about the environment that they were in that was calling up, so to speak, that was inducing these withdrawal symptoms. It turns out that, of course, if a person used the drug, the withdrawal symptoms would be relieved immediately. And the other interesting thing that Wickler noted was that the amount of drug needed was the same they used prior to incarceration. Now, you'll all recognize that phenomena we call tolerance, and that is that you need more of the drug for the same effect. But these guys were in prison for years and didn't use, and went back to using the same amount. They didn't have to build up tolerance again. So imagine that you start doing some cardio exercise. Okay, so let's talk about this issue of tolerance. You do some cardio exercise. You're running, you're biking, or whatever, and in a few months you can run 5 miles. Now, if you go to jail for 6 months and get out, you're not going to be able to get out and run 5 miles on the first time out, right? So, like cardio, you need more of the drug for the same effect. I mean, as the first few weeks of running, you get better and better. You get, better super, super fast, but then you plateau. Okay, but tolerance is very different. Tolerance just isn't getting used to or getting in shape of. Tolerance does not decrease with absence. Okay, your changes in musculature and endurance are not permanent, but drug tolerance seems to last a really, really, really long time. So tolerance just isn't practice, it just isn't working out your body. Tolerance is a different phenomena than something like exercise would be. It's not just your body getting used to it, it's not just your body getting better at handling it. it's something different because it lasts a super long time. The old neighborhood produces withdrawal symptoms. Withdrawal symptoms are those associated with non-use or the opposite of using heroin. So what process seems to exert its effects for really long periods of time? Well, if it's not exercise, what is it? Well, it's learning. If you learn how to ride a bike, 10 years from now, you'll be able to get on a bike and be almost as competent riding a bike as you were if you learned today. So this seems to appeal to some sort of learning process, not just your body getting used to metabolizing the drug or getting better at metabolizing the drug. Your body is learning to get better at this, and it's that learning that is permanent, because learning seems to be permanent or last a really long time. What's been proposed to account for tolerance is the classical conditioning of opponent processes, or what we call in the drug abuse world compensatory responses. Okay. Opiates, heroin, morphine, Oxycontin, Percocet, Vicodin, these are pain-relieving medications normally. When given the first time, they produce bradycardia. If you take this drug, your heart rate will decrease. You'll experience hyperthermia. You'll feel a little bit warm, and it has analgesic effects. You'll get pain relief. These are unconditional responses to these opiates. These are the URs. The drug is the unconditional stimulus. So if I give you this drug, you'll have the reflex of bradycardia, hyperthermia, analgesia. Okay, we do an experiment. It was Siegel, I think, that first did this experiment, where he presents a red light, he gives a rat heroin, and its heart rate goes from 300 beats per minute down to 200 beats per minute. He does it again, and he does it again, and he does it again, and what he sees is that the drug becomes less and less effective at reducing heart rate. And if you plot this on a graph, what you see is originally over here, the first dose of the heroin reduces blood beats per minute or heart rate, but over time, something happens, and it comes to and the heroin is no longer effective at producing a reduction in heart rate. If you present just the red light, what you see is an increase in heart rate. Okay? So, what we think is going on, or what we're pretty sure is going on, is that the first use, okay, there is, and the drug UR is here in blue, and the conditioned response to something. In this case, let's talk about the if we look back here, we get a reduction, less of a reduction until we're back to baseline. When we test the red light alone, we see that the red light increases heart rate. That's what this represents. So what we do is we see conditioning to the red light of an increase in heart rate. The effect of the heroin, which is represented here, is to reduce heart rate. Conditioning to the red light increases heart rate. So this conditioned response at first is nothing. So the net effect on the first use is that we see this decrease in heart rate because there's no conditioned response to the red light. Now what I have here is feeling bad and feeling good as if this were a drug. But what we see over time, the explanation of this, is that the CR, the conditioned response, the conditional response to events surrounding the application or the ingestion or the administration of the drug is the opposite of the unconditional response. The net effect here is in green. And what we see is something like this. Okay? What we see is that there's very little net effect for taking the drug. There's not the robust high that we saw in the first use. This is the first use of taking, let's say, heroin, and you feel really, really good. But as you repeatedly use it, the magnitude of the CR is increased. This is conditioning to the point where what we have is we have no high, or maybe just a minimal high. Now, what if the CR is elicited without the drug? Well, the old neighborhood for these drug abusers, as Wickler noted, was the CS. And if we have the CS alone, what we have is the CR alone and the net effect. Remember, there's no drug on board. So all with the net effect is the effect of just the CS. The CS elicits this horrible feeling, these withdrawal symptoms. This potentiates the drug. This gives the drug power to remove these effects. So we think what the unconditioned response does is potentiate drug as a reinforcer, removes the withdrawal symptoms. Now, what a lot of drug users try to do is maintain the effect. And in order to maintain the effect, what you have to do is you have to take more drug. You have to get a larger drug unconditional response in order to maintain the green, right? This is the first administration. The CR is very small, but if the CR gets larger, you need more drug for the same effect. This is tolerance. As the CR becomes more powerful and comes on quicker, that's what you need to do. You need more drug for the same effect. So Pavlovian conditioning can explain both the removal of physical symptoms or withdrawal symptoms and tolerance. Okay. Now, what happens if the drug CR is not elicited, but the drug is administered? And the answer to that question is we see an overdose. And we often hear about people who will take drugs or taking drugs in a new environment or in a new situation. The conditioned response is not elicited. The drug is administered in the dose that they normally use in their ritualistic sort of situation. And what does it do? It produces an overdose. Drug US alleviates cravings or withdrawal symptoms. This is what we call physical dependence. The Pavlovian conditioning compensatory responses that are opposite of the UR of the drug can explain this effect. And it can explain the effect of tolerance. More of the drug is required for the same effect. Again, Pavlovian conditioning compensatory responses over time dampens the effects of the drug. So, hopefully that helps you see how we can use Pavlovian conditioning to understand drug abuse and compensatory responses. It turns out that this becomes important in understanding why people relapse. People continue to go back to the same place where they use, and of course it elicits withdrawal symptoms and cravings and so on, and they continue to take drugs. Relapse is the norm in drug abuse, and it's because people are going from a situation to therapy or maybe through treatment or a hospital or whatever, but then they go back to the same situation that elicits those cravings and withdrawal symptoms. How do we change this? That's a good question, that's hard to do. So hopefully that explains stuff for Chapter 4. Good luck. We'll see you guys soon.